Okay, so this is my third time making this video. Hopefully third time is the charm. So for this video, I chose to discuss chapter 3 of Rousseau's The Social Contract called Of the Right of the Strongest. And essentially, I'm going to be paraphrasing, I wrote a script and I'm going to be paraphrasing what I wrote in that script about the 3 paragraphs he wrote about this chapter. And then I'm going to compare it to Hobbes' ideas about, social contracts governing and human nature in general. And I'll talk about how Rousseau strays from Hobbes' ideas, and then I'll talk about the ideas I agreed about with Rousseau. So in his first paragraph, Rousseau argues that the strongest cannot ensure that others will continually obey them unless they transform their means of force into justice and mindless obedience into a sense of duty. This essentially means that transforming the motivations of the governed subjects from submitting out of fear to serving through a sense of honor and obligation instead. The right of the strongest is, in this sense, the strength of character and principles, rather than the strongest through force. Force within politics is tricky. It's a physical power, and it's necessary to yield to this kind of physical force, but in one sense is yielding to power a sense of duty or moral obligation. There's no moral obligation behind it, and this is where Rousseau finds the problem with force is right. So, furthermore, from this, Rousseau concludes that right through force is complete nonsense. If force equals right, there is no clear sense of what is right and wrong. Rather, the right varies with whoever yields this power. If force justifies right, acts of evil, wrong, and injustice are easily justified through this concept. If strength creates a sense of what's right and wrong, strength is all that leaders will try to acquire. There'll be no sense for them to try to instill any kind of moral obligation or sense of duty. The sense of right and wrong that's built with this strength easily crumbles itself because it easily crumbles through a stronger force. The force that initially gave its power in the first place. It's very paradoxical because if the force is what defines the power and what people follow, if there's a stronger force that supersedes it and takes over, then now they follow this force, but the force that initially led them was superseded by another force. It's just like there's no base inside this power. There's nothing that keeps it there, nothing that cements this power besides the force that they wield. And if it's superseded by a stronger force, then there's nothing there. There's no base for this concept of governing power. Any obligation to power begins and ends at the power that it wields. There's no sense of moral obligation or duty at all. The obedience created through force becomes meaningless when force equals right, and any sense of moral obligation is lost. And in this case, there's no meaning at all in the word right when power is a wielding force. When force is wielded, yeah. And then finally, from this, Rousseau argues that when people say to obey the powerful, and essentially they mean to say obey their force, the principle itself is valid by saying that because that's just like a general statement. But it's redundant to say this because it's just generally agreed upon without question. Like, you have to obey a force. If someone's threatening you, it just makes sense to yield to this power because you don't want to get hurt. It's obvious that we just obey the powerful, but where's the moral sense in that? Where's the moral obligation? Where's the sense of duty? Rousseau uses an analogy to explain this. Sorry, I got cut off. Rousseau uses an analogy to explain this idea where he concedes that all power comes from a bigger, stronger authority, such as God. And in this case, diseases will come from the same powerful force of God, but we still call in a doctor when there's diseases. Furthermore, are we obligated to give a robber our belongings when we have the means to escape this robber? Because if we must submit to power, as this concept says, the means that the robber uses to hold us there is power. Like, if they have a gun against us, that is power. Do we submit to that power mindlessly? Do we obey that power? Rousseau uses these analogies to show that in the same sense, it's sometimes illogical and insensible to just adhere to power when there's a better way or a better alternative. And both of these conclusions show that power through force is not the way. Rousseau concludes that force does not constitute right. That's literally what he says, word for word. Force does not constitute right. And obedience comes from a sense of legitimate moral duty rather than force. And when coming to this conclusion, he comes back to his first sentence about how if the strongest cannot ensure that others will continually obey them unless they transform their means of force into justice and mindless obedience into a sense of duty. There's no strength behind this force. There's an initial fear, but there's no base around it. Like I said earlier, when force supersedes force, there's nothing that holds the people to that previous power besides the force that they were wielding against them. And when force is used to take that power from them, it crumbles. And then from this point, I'm going to talk about Hobbes and how Rousseau strays from Hobbes and how I feel about Rousseau himself. Rousseau's ideas stray from Hobbes, who argues that fear, manipulation, and force should be used to concede people into obedience, and that fear is a powerful enough factor to keep others in line to obey. He ignores that other men might be controlled by Hobbes, ignores that other men, and when I say other men, I mean mankind itself, but Hobbes ignores that mankind might be controlled by motivations other than an instinctual fear, and that mankind is more complex creatures who can be controlled by morals and pride. In my opinion, Rousseau still holds Hobbes' practicality in the way that he explains his ideas, rather than the idealistic and, in some cases, unrealistic views of Plato, Aristotle, or Confucius, who I feel sometimes get a little utopian. And I agree with their reasoning, but there's no sense of logic behind what they say. Like, there's no authenticity, no realistic kind of way of getting to their conclusions. While Rousseau can submit and he can admit that force, Rose admits that force isn't power. He doesn't stray from logic as well. He reasons that force through power holds no substantiality because of its cause and effect. And by cause and effect, it's kind of what I was talking about earlier about how force supersedes force. So if the cause of power is through force, people follow that power, but when it gets superseded, they follow this power. The cause and effect doesn't work in that sense. And that force can only be superseded by force. There's no justice, and the governed will inevitably stray from this force of power only held by force alone. People need a sense of undeniable truth and justice to cement them in their power. They need something to follow rather than fear. And these are the views that I agree with Rousseau in. I feel that his logic is streamlined and grounded in a realistic sense of human nature. He admits and he submits that even though he doesn't believe in power through force, he knows that humans can be ruled by instinctual fear. That's how Hobbes was able to grab these ideas, right? Like, people can be ruled by fear, and he admits that. But he also knows that people need morality, they need moral obligation, they need a sense of duty. And I feel like Rousseau is in the middle, where there's the extreme utopians like Aristotle, Plato, Confucius, who have this idealistic view of human nature. There's Hobbes, who has this very pessimistic view of human nature, of ruling through fear and totalitarianism. And then there's, I wouldn't say totalitarianism, but he's very dictatorship-ish. And Rousseau, I feel like, is a good middle ground, a good compromise, where it's not even really a compromise because he's idealistic, but he knows that people can be ruled by fear. So I feel like he can admit to people's faults, but he also knows that they're better than that. They're more complex than that, and they're more than the fear that grounds them, but they need morality as well. And that is how I feel about Rousseau.